Yeah.
Today, we're speaking with one of Australia's most esteemed social researchers and author, Rebecca Huntley, about her latest and sixth book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. So welcome, Rebecca. Thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's okay. Absolutely loved your book. So firstly, in your own words, what was the goal of this book? And why do you think it was an important book to write?
So it's an important book for me to write because I wanted to find a way to talk about an issue that I've got to say I've arrived at late in life, but it's become a passionate interest, which is climate change. So how can I be effective personally and professionally in talking about it to people in a way that will really connect with them and be persuasive rather than, you know, getting a bit drunk and yelling at people at parties, which can be fun. And the goal really was to write, you know, it was quite a modest goal. Could I write a useful, easy to read and somewhat uplifting book about how we can better communicate about climate change by understanding our emotional response to climate change, understanding a little bit about the research, the social research that looks at how people respond to different messages about climate change. And then hopefully the reader walks away with some tips, some insight into themselves and others so that they can sustain the conversation around climate change that we need to be having it, you know, in every part of our society, in the most productive and effective ways, in the time we have allocated, which, as you and I know, is not really that long.
It sure is. Yeah. So it's a formidable goal because it's sort of fight smarter, not harder, right?
That's right. That's right. And I suppose where it starts is with all good communication starts with understanding and empathy with the person that you're trying to talk to. So, I mean, it would be very easy for you and I to sit and talk about climate change for hours because we probably have very similar views. It is a lot harder to have a conversation with somebody who isn't necessarily shares your background, shares a lot of your values, hasn't necessarily come to the issue in the same way as you. How do you talk about it in a way where you don't just, you know, it doesn't just descend into a Twitter-like, you know, finger pointing and calling the other person stupid or naive or any of those other kinds of things that we say. But you know, in the reasonably short time that I've been focusing my career and my, you know, professional and personal life on climate communications, I continue to see people manage to make those breakthroughs in their amongst their family and friends, in their workplaces, in their communities, online and offline, and that's great to see. It's possible.
Sure. Yeah, because I've always said, you know, if you want to try it, bring someone over to your side and make them understand your point of view. If you start an argument and you start, you know, yelling at each other, it becomes almost impossible. But so I try hold that back, but sometimes it's hard because I'm sure you and, you know, many of the viewers are aware. One of the most frustrating people to speak with about climate change is climate deniers. So what advice would you give when speaking to someone who's been caught up in this sort of worldview? Because it's strange how common they are.
Yeah, so look, the research shows us about 9% of the Australian population are what we would describe as dismissive about climate. So dismissive both about the science and the solutions. I mean, there's people who are hardcore, you know, denier or delayers and warriors, which would be a smaller, you know, kind of really evangelical about it, I suppose, and that'd be a smaller group. When we cut that data by people under 25, that goes down to 1%. So we're really talking about a small percentage of the population. Look, for me, climate deniers are really hardcore climate deniers are often so funny that it's hard. They're often so amusing. They're hard to take seriously. So, for example, the recently elevated Minister Pitt, who in the federal cabinet, the federal cabinet on the Conservative side of politics, who says that we can't have renewable energy because solar panels don't work in the dark. And whether he thinks that or he wants us to think about that is another question. For me, some of the most frustrating conversations, actually, really, and I had some of them last night when I was doing a focus group, are people who believe the climate science, know it's a serious threat, want something to happen, but just can't believe that we can do it. So they're either people saying, oh, well, we can't rely on renewable energy, or, we can't have, there are more jobs in coal and gas, and we're going to need to burn coal and gas for the next 100 years, or even say things like we need nuclear energy. It's actually people who actually have the best interests of themselves, the communities, care for the environment. They just need to find a reason to believe. And often, because climate change isn't a big issue for them, they can be really susceptible to misinformation campaigns by the fossil fuel industry and its representatives in Parliament. So they will often, so not so much that they don't think climate change is happening, but they don't think we have the solutions, and they've lost the faith in our leaders to be able to make those changes. And for me, what's so frustrating about that is that these are people who could be persuaded, but that it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy to be able to engage them on the issues. And there's many more of these people than there are deniers. And so that I often find really difficult, because what we have to engender in those kinds of people who believe in climate change but wonder whether we can do it is information, belief, confidence in ourselves as a country, confidence in our leaders, and that is, really, really difficult. For many of the people that are in the research that I do, they feel like they're going backwards. They feel like they're, can't afford to buy a home. They're worried about jobs. They're just worried. They're anxious. And so when you talk to them about something big and scary like climate change and the kind of energy transition and heroic acts of leadership we need to get there, you can understand why they're skeptical. You can understand why they're cynical. And so for me, that's the challenge, and that can be the much more frustrating conversation. I mean, I've had climate deniers have a go at me on Twitter like anybody, like you would have, anybody, and block. It's kind of really, I never think twice about it, but I can go away from a lot of this research where people feel the way they do, feeling a bit like, well, more, what can we do? How can we convince them that this is something that is not only doable, but something that we can't sit on our hands about? We can't just wait for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's not a problem for our grandchildren. It's a problem for us today.
Yeah, because I read in one page of your book where you spoke about the allure of climate denialism, because, it's, I even have friends, very well-educated friends who, say that, humans didn't cause climate change. It exists. The climate is changing. It's always been changing, but humans didn't cause it. And, it sounds so much easier. It sounds so much calmer and more freeing in a way, but I have to stop myself. Because, it's just, not a good path to take, but it's alluring for sure. Yeah.
I mean, what do you say in those kinds of situations when they say that? I mean, to tell you the truth, there are times when I'm just tired. It's the end of the day and you just do want to, vent. I mean, the difficulty that's a line that gets trotted out in groups a lot. And focus groups are very much about trying to listen to people and elicit their responses and not necessarily push back with facts all the time, because you're just trying to understand how people feel. Although when people say things, misleading things like we've got nuclear energy in Australia or whatever, I have to kind of, anything that's a kind of an outright kind of very clearly addressable, untruth, I do. But the stuff about the climate changing, I tend to say, sure, yeah, the climate has changed over millennia, but never this quickly, never caused by us, and never in a way that's quite as detrimental to the life of every single human being on Earth. So And more importantly, when the climate was changing previously, that was a natural cycle that, woolly mammoths couldn't do much about. But today we have the technology to try and address some of the changes that we've brought about. I mean, one of the things that is almost unrecognized and unknown beyond the climate and scientific community is just the level of consensus from people who are paid to understand climate science that we are causing it. It's been 96%, 97%. It's as certain as people with PhDs ever get. And as somebody with a PhD, part of what it is to be a PhD and an academic is to constantly, do you understand what I mean? The rigor and the kind of try and get an academic to make a definitive statement about anything, including what they want for dinner, is always a challenge. That's the nature of their training. But the extent to which, we have proven that climate change is caused by us to the absolute nth degree that the scientific method allows us. When people understand that, when people understand the extent to which, businesses, governments around the world, communities, sectors, industries, you name it, are listening to those scientists and changing, then you start to paint a picture around people for whom climate change makes them feel powerless, frustrated and angry, that actually action is happening and is possible. And then if you engender that level of confidence, then you begin potentially to engage people with the solutions. But we are trying to catch up with doing that, with that kind of, with the time we have, the technology we have, and the public persuasion piece that we have. We are working very hard, which is why I work 7 days a week and drink a lot of coffee, which I'm sure you do. Which I'm sure you feel the same thing.
Heavens for coffee. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Okay.
Fair trade coffee, of course, though. Fair trade.
Of course. All right. So you spoke about how there's a consensus on the science, and that's really clear across the board. But you also spoke about how talking about the science can sometimes be part of the problem with some people, because, if people listen to science, there'd be no smokers, everyone would, recycle.
Everybody would eat well. I think that's right. Look, I don't want to say for a moment that we need a kind of post-fact, fact-free, fake news approach to climate. We just have to understand, we have to start, instead of starting with the science, we do need to start with the person we're trying to talk to. So we have to have an audience first rather than science first approach. Now, if you're talking to an audience that, so I'll give you a really perfect example. I do a lot of, do quite a bit of work with healthcare professionals, everything from GPs to specialists to midwives to people just broadly in the healthcare services. Some of whom have been extremely engaged on climate. The AMA, a lot of the peak unions, you name it, first responders have spoken out about climate. This is a profession where they broadly respect and understand science, right? And so potentially if you're fronting up to a conference of a whole lot of medical specialists, starting with the science is effective, right? Because that's a kind of a body of knowledge and a way of thinking that's accessible to them.
Speaking their language.
Exactly. Now, if you're fronting up to a whole lot of people who haven't necessarily done science, the last time they did science was in high school, but perhaps all of them are farmers, you wouldn't necessarily start with the science. You might start with a conversation about what they've noticed about how their land, their animals, their natural environment that they get their living from, how that's changed over time. Or even small things like where the places they go fishing have changed, or where the places they go camping have changed. So you might start, and then you might try and connect that with the science from spokespeople that they really respect. It might be the CSIRO, it might be a local regional university where their kids go and study, who knows? So it's not that I'm saying science is important. What I'm saying is, how do we start the conversation with people? And if you start the conversation with a whole lot of slides with ziggly lines and all of this language that people don't understand, and I find it hard, I'm a social scientist, not a natural scientist. There's immediately a barrier. Yeah, unless the farmer did a degree in science, which
Cool.
so it's part of it is, you know, one of the things that I always say when I do a bit of a climate communications 101 presentation, which is before you even open your mouth, understand your audience. Listen to them. What are the things that really matter to them? You know, what are their values and what do they value? And then, you know, that's when you have an opportunity to engage and talk about and to find a way to talk about climate change. Because, I mean, one of the terrifying things about climate change is that it touches and has the potential to touch every aspect of our lives. But that's also an opportunity because you can connect climate change or solutions to climate change to so many things, to so many people at so many kind of levels.
Yeah, and reading your book, I also came across a point you were making about shaming as a tactic when, you know, advocating for climate change. Because I see in some causes a lot of people resort to shaming because it's quite an easy tactic to use. I think it's quite a knee-jerk tactic. But why would you avoid shame?
Yeah, so I think I definitely think that if you're our Prime Minister and our Minister for the Environment and you go to a global conference on climate, you should be shamed. and I think we can see that that can be quite an effective tactic to put pressure on the government to be able to engage with an issue that previously they have done whatever they can to try and avoid, obfuscate, and all the rest of it. I mean, watching that incredible footage of that and sorry, I don't have a name in front of me, that extraordinary climate activist from Fiji standing up in front of world leaders and talking about the impact of climate change on her country. You know, they kind of, you know, they were cutting to all, you know, royalty and various political leaders and cut to Scott Morrison. And he looked very, very uncomfortable. You know, I mean, they are some of our closest neighbours. They are at the forefront of climate effects. So I think that shame can be effective for people. They can be shamed, and they should be shamed if their inaction is putting people's lives at risk, which is what's happening. But
So
communications one-on-one with another person, with your mum, or it's not necessarily the best way to go. Some of the research, as you would know in the book, talks about that guilt, if it's connected to responsibility and gives people an out in terms of, and this is what you can do, can be an incredibly effective series of emotional states that you can step people through. So, you know, I mean, you know, I really love eating meat. I love meat. I love it. I would eat it all the time if I could. Do I understand what a high, for somebody like me, a diet heavy in meat does in terms of impact to the climate? You know, we know so much of deforestation in Australia is actually driven by land clearing in order for beef and various other things. The industry is doing what it can, you know, doing some stuff in terms of reducing its impact on the climate. But, you know, I feel a bit guilty eating it all the time. I eat it less, and that makes me feel a bit better about it. So, you know, just feeling guilty about eating meat, but feeling also a sense of responsibility, and then knowing that I can do things and that can have an impact is very important. The other problem with shame is that it can't always be scaled up to effective collective action. Anger can, care and love can, a whole lot of some of those other emotions can, hope can, but shame can really rebound. We do want people to feel a sense of responsibility, and if guilt is part of that, then so be it. But we don't want any barriers to action, and sometimes shame can make people feel like they just want to shut off because they feel like they're being personally attacked, rather than like as they're a bad person, rather that they are in a system that doesn't encourage them to necessarily make the right decisions for the climate and the environment, which is what the reality is.
Yeah, because with anger, that's a very interesting one, because I feel like anger and despair can be quite closely linked. You know, we had a lady over here get arrested the other day for spray painting her local Liberal MP's offices, you know, with a bunch of rhetorics such as, you know, you're not doing enough on climate change, you know, get your head out of the sand sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was having a debate with some friends. Sometimes people, you know, use these sort of tactics, these non-violent direct actions to get out of feeling despair. But yeah, it isn't always the best thing to do. So, you know, spray paint a building. But what sort of advice would you give to someone who's feeling despair about the climate? Because it can weigh so heavy on the soul and on the mind.
Of course. And in a sense, even though I'm not a member of Extinction Rebellion, I can completely, or people that, you know, engage in that kind of action, I can completely understand the feelings that drive that.
Yes.
So I can, in some ways, it's very logical. You know, in some ways it's logical, even though it isn't always productive, and I wouldn't always encourage it. But the first thing I say, and I ask this question, been asked this question a lot, the first thing I can say is, no social movement that has attempted to address structural inequality and bring about a real change in the way that people see the world, whether that be, you know, around race, gender, you name it, around the rights of workers, you know, whatever, you know, slavery, hasn't had people that have been prepared to throw themselves under a horse, or you know what I mean, or lie in front of a bus or blow something up. You know, it's a thing when you really are faced with an enormous challenge about getting something to change, where there's a lot of money and a lot of power at stake. So we're naive to think that people aren't going, that these tactics haven't been important and part of the way that people pick apart, you know, you know, structures of inequality and structures that are destructive to our future. So that's the first thing I would say. I suppose the second thing I would say is that I think it's, you know, that there's, I would never, I mean, you don't want people tied up too much in processes of, you know, the criminal justice system and having to get money, you know what I mean, having any of those kinds of problems that you have when you suddenly get tied up with, you know, having to deal with, you know, being in court and going to prison and fines and all the rest of it. Some of those things are very effective. We've seen some really effective legal interventions around people bringing class actions against, you know, large, you know, big polluters and big governments not being able to do their own thing. So if we're going to be spending any money on lawyers, we should be spending it on that. I think part of this, if somebody came to me and said, I want to spray paint, spray paint the side of a building or get really angry at a politician, I'd understand it. I think that protests can be incredibly silent. Protests can be incredibly effective. A whole range of really interesting strategies can be effective. I think part of it can be recognizing that these changes are slower than we want them to be. They're frustrating. You can understand why people just have bursts of anger and want things to change. This is why we need to make the many, many pathways towards climate action visible to people. And we need to talk about what can be most effective and what can make the greatest impact. And while spray painting a building can feel really, really effective at that time, it may be that one of the more effective things is finding a way to getting 50 or 60 or 70 or 100 of your friends to divest their super. Or alternatively, then getting that 50 and 100 friends to make an appointment with that MP who live in that electorate and say, oh, by the way, we're just going to turn up at every single community meeting you ever do every single, every single street stall, every single photo op, we're going to ask you a question about climate change. We are just going to continue to harass you in the most democratic fashion about what you're doing. So that's what I would say. But I totally understand that level of frustration and anger, and you feel that particularly when you read the science and when you read just the amount of money and the amount of misinformation that is out there around climate and climate solutions. It's one of the reasons why, even though it pops up all the time when I'm online, some story from Sky News saying, around climate, which is just basically an outright distortion or a lie. I just don't read the article because I know it's going to trigger me.
Because I think it was a quote in your book. You said, "Climate change is a game, not a fight." Something like that. Not
a war. A game, not a war.
True. That's it. Yeah, which is so true, because a lot of the time the most effective course, isn't necessarily spray painting a building or something or other, but it is divesting your super. It is meeting with MP, learning the science and helping to educate them. So
look, I want to go to that point. That's really interesting. So that was actually not even my comment. It was a comment made by a bit of advice that was given by a father to a woman who I interviewed from the Philippines in the book, who's a kind of climate activist and very focused on the seas around the Philippines. And she was getting really angry. She was constantly angry. And her father, who was an environmental lawyer, said, I want you to think of this as a game and not a war. In a war, you're always angry and you don't win people over when you're angry. And when I think of it as a game, I don't think of it as a game as like in a flippant way. I think of it as a game in Game of Thrones, which is Game of Thrones is that, lots of things happen. Suddenly, things feel like they're moving forward. Then the things that you want to have happen, Ned Stark gets killed and then something else happens. It's convoluted, it's like 3 steps forward, 10 steps back. It's a complex strategy. And part of it's about how you're making sure that all the pieces fall. So in the end, all the baddies are dead and there's a reasonable, you know what I mean? All of that, all the barriers to a better world are gone, killed by somebody or sent off, to the, buried in a pile of rubble, and a reasonable group of reasonable people are left standing to try and run a livable world. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. So we're in an epic Game of Thrones kind of process that we hope will end with all the people or basically most of the characters we like still standing.
Hopefully. Okay, so that about wraps it up. Lastly, Is there any sort of parting advice you'd like to leave any of the viewers?
I think that I just want you to, what do I do every day when I wake up and think about the work that needs to be done? I spend a lot of time talking and being with the people who are doing that work. This feels overwhelming only when you feel alone, and know that there is a extraordinarily diverse, determined global movement of really millions of people really who care about the climate and are trying to do that work. And, I don't know if you've been watching COP this week, but David Attenborough spoke and he said something I think really profound. He said, if individual countries have managed to destabilize the environment on their own, can you imagine if we all got together and collaborated, how much we could reverse that? And so really it's about, and it kind of goes back to what I talk about in the book, which is hope is other people. The moment that you think this is really just about you and how you vote and what you buy and everything, it is a bit about that. But I want you to think of yourself as part of a diverse, sprawling, incredibly effective and determined global movement to get this done. It's hard, but it's doable.
Yeah, and when I speak to people like you, I feel hope, and I'm filled with hope right now. So
Great,
yeah,
I'm so glad.
Yes, thank you so much for speaking with us here at WA Forest Alliance. Rebecca Huntley, it means a lot.
Thanks.